Have you heard of the lawsuit brought against the National Association of Realtors and some of the largest brokers in the nation? The Sitzer-Burnett case? NAR settled. $418 million will be paid over the span of a few years, and some rules are changing as well. Because of this lawsuit, if you plan on buying or selling a house, you need to know there are significant changes coming to the home selling and home buying process. In this video, I'm going to give you insights for what these powerful changes mean for you. This is not a simple topic, but it will be worth the watch. Feel free to reach out with questions. Although the lawsuit has not yet been fully settled, a preliminary approval for the settlement was granted by the court in April this year. Final approval is scheduled for November 26, 2024. In the meantime, real estate practice changes will take effect on August 17, 2024 regardless. I want to mention one exception. The Northwest MLS is opting out of the settlement lawsuit. Short story, they've already made changes and they believe that these changes satisfy the spirit of the lawsuit. If you live in Washington State, be sure to look into this. As for the rest of us, the new rules apply. Behind the scenes, because of the NAR settlement, the real estate industry is in a state of confusion. Not quite chaos, but it's close in my opinion. What's important is, for home buyers, these rule changes may impact your ability to buy a house. If you're a home seller, these new rules may change how you see buyer agent compensation altogether. Most everyone knows what the MLS is. For those that don't, here's a 4-second definition. The Multiple Listing Service is a database used by brokers to share real property information with each other and the world. That's it. And it works really well. Just ask Zillow, Realtor.com, Redfin, Trulia, and Homes.com to name a few. The lawsuit is bringing changes. Of the several that are coming in August, there are 2 changes that are causing the most confusion. Number 1, buyer representation agreements. Number 2, buyer-broker compensation advertisement. I call it advertisement because that's what it all boils down to for that particular issue. Now, for buyer's rep agreements. The first change is buyer agents and home buyers will need to sign a buyer representation agreement before they start touring homes. This was not the case before the lawsuit. It was best practice, but not required before touring. Now it will be. A buyer's representation agreement spells out what an agent will do and what the buyer is responsible for, including an agreement to pay buyer agent commission themselves if they choose to buy a house where the seller is not offering compensation, or making up the difference if the seller offer falls short. Compared to the current process, this is pre-August 17, 2024, the major changes are the requirement to sign before touring, plus the new rules also set the limit a buyer agent can be compensated. This agreement, in effect, converts a customer into a client with all the rights, privileges, restrictions, and requirements that come with a contract. For a lot of buyers, I'd say most buyers, signing a contract on the first meeting with an agent is often going to be a challenge. Signing a contract that possibly obligates them to pay a buyer agent commission out of pocket instead of by the seller is what we're used to is really going to be a tough sell. For reference, the single most common phrase uttered by a buyer meeting an agent for the first time is,
"I'm not signing anything today."
And I get that. I'm like that. Because it's expected that getting a buyer contract signed on the first day will be tricky, touring agreements have been created to bridge the huge trust gap between parties that don't know one another yet. Touring agreements allow agents to take buyers to view homes at no cost, no obligation for a period of time to build trust. Makes sense to me. However, the touring agreement creates an unintended consequence, in my opinion, that effectively creates a get-out-of-jail-free card for the buyer because it literally is a document that says the agent will facilitate the touring of homes for no charge and there is an expiration date. This is a dream come true for looky-loos who really just want tour guides and door openers to quench their curiosity and get real estate questions answered before they turn around, run out the clock, and go directly to the listing agent and attempt to buy a home as an unrepresented buyer, which creates another unintended consequence, which is this. Unrepresented buyers introduce great risk to the transaction for the sellers and the agent, not to mention the buyer themselves, and if they're smart, many sellers and agents will say no thanks to this. Back to the touring agreement. Ultimately, If the touring goes well, agent and buyer will decide to formalize their relationship by signing a buyer representation agreement and all that comes with it. Let's talk about the buyer having to pay for buyer agent commissions in some cases. To avoid this, all that needs to be done is to not engage in a house where the seller is offering no commission or concession. I'll say again, there's nothing new here, inasmuch as buyers were always responsible for a commission deficit, if that was agreed to in the buyer rep agreement. However, there may be a difference now with the rule changes in the number of sellers opting out of buyer agent commissions. I believe we'll see this as growing pains. I'll get back to that shortly. That leaves one single issue to handle. Does the buyer like the agent they've signed a contract to work with, or are they stuck with someone that they don't like? That's a toughie. Goes both ways. The second rule change is buyer agent compensation will be removed from the MLS entirely. We have to differentiate compensation from concessions. Sorry about this. I was trying to keep things simple, but some things just aren't. Compensation is what an agent gets paid. Concession is what the seller offers the buyer to offset any buyer expense to include buyer agent commission. Huge difference. Starting August 17th, instead of compensation field on the MLS, viewable only by the agent like it used to be, a concessions field with a dollar amount may be advertised on all listings for consumers and agents alike. I say maybe because I don't believe it's going to be required. This option is being offered in the spirit of transparency, but the rules stipulate concessions are, this is legalese, not limited to or conditioned on the retention of or payment to a buyer's agent. What this means in plain English is that this money is not necessarily offered for agent compensation alone. It is a bucket of money that is being offered for the buyer to use as they choose as an enticement to purchase that home. For an agent to learn if and how much compensation is being offered on any particular home, moving forward, they must now communicate with the listing agent off MLS. My guess is going to be a phone call, text, or email, something like that will be used. Some are saying just include it in the contract cold. I'm saying I'd like to have some idea of what I'm getting into before we get into negotiations, writing contracts and stuff, especially if the buyer has let me know in advance they cannot or will not pay buyer agent commission. Here's where things get fuzzy as if they aren't already. Here's the process we're leaving behind. In the past, a listing agreement was written this way. It spelled out a commission amount that was to be paid to the listing agent's broker by the seller as a fee for selling the home. The broker then offered a portion of that fee to the buyer agent's broker. This was how compensation was offered on the MLS. With the new rules, buyers and sellers, not listing brokers and sellers, may now negotiate a concession amount or a compensation amount in the contract. One example might be to specify in the contract how the concession funds are allocated. Designate a specific amount for agent compensation and another specific amount to closing costs or whatever they're asking for from the total funds. Concessions may or may not be advertised on the MLS by the seller to entice buyers. In my opinion, another reason to communicate up front with the listing agent. As I said before, the commission amount for the buyer agent cannot exceed what was agreed to in the buyer representation agreement. I'm okay with that. And finally, here's where things get sticky. I've already said if the seller doesn't offer concessions or compensation, the buyer has to cover those expenses. For some buyers, these situations may make certain home purchases impossible, or at least for some, a deciding factor whether to pursue a particular home or not. I said before that these rule changes may affect how sellers see participation in paying buyer agent commissions. I believe more sellers will opt out of contributing to buyer expenses until sellers learn by losing contracts this approach doesn't work very well. The reason I believe this is because instead of commissions being baked into the listing agreement and a net sheet calculated from that like it used to be, now buyer agent commissions will be line item stipulations with big numbers attached that will be much more easily seen as an option to be waived or countered and make it the buyer's problem. It is on this hill where a lot of agents are going to fall apart. This will bring some serious downward pressure to commissions. Ultimately, the market will better out. Buyers and sellers will find their equilibrium, but not before both test the limits of the market. And after a ton of trial and error, winners and losers, we will all figure out what works and what doesn't. But until then, like my cousin used to say, there will be lots of tears and gnashing of the teeth. Will these policy changes bring the desired results the plaintiffs were hoping for? I, for one, don't think they give a rip. They couldn't care less about me or you or the real estate industry. They're just in it for the lawsuit and the money, full stop. Somewhere, someone felt ripped off and were pissed off enough to push hard enough until all this happened, so here we are. If you're getting value from my videos and you want to be the first to learn about changing real estate markets, hit subscribe and tap the bell. That'll help both of us. Thanks so much. See you later. Talk to you soon.